My name is Sheila Lamerson, and I've brought in a uniform of Brigadier General Sheila Hellstrom, the first female general in the Canadian Forces. She was a role model from the get-go. You know, in 1987, if you were a woman in the military in 1987, you knew who Sheila Hellstrom was.
Like most nations, Canada was slow to welcome women into its military. Midway through World War II, Canada created women's auxiliaries to the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Initially, women were restricted to roles such as nurses, cooks, seamstresses, and secretaries. That eventually expanded to include jobs as parachute riggers, laboratory assistants, drivers, mechanics, electricians, and code breakers. But combat roles remained forbidden. More progress came through the 1970s, and then in the 80s, after Parliament passed the Human Rights Act and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, combat roles were finally opened to women in 1989, with the exception of serving on submarines, which opened in 2001.
So, Cheryl, I'd like to welcome you to the show here today. The uniforms here, we've got the different variations in color, and also, of course, the texture and the changes. Women's uniforms changed, of course, in the time of this period as well, too.
Right. By 1982, when they come out with this uniform, for whatever reason, they've changed the color slightly. It's still dark green, but they've changed the color. It's a longer jacket. The skirt had a little bit of a flare on it, and oh my gosh, it was heaven. We got issued pants. It was the first time that the dress uniform, women were allowed to wear pants. And that meant when you went on parade, you could be wearing pants. In this uniform, when you went on parade, if there were men on parade, you pretty much split the seams on your skirt because you couldn't keep up with the men unless you were breaking the skirt.
We're going to talk about something a bit bigger than the uniforms here. We're going to talk about Canada's first Brigadier General.
Yes, first female Brigadier General, Sheila Ann Hellstrom.
You worked for her, right?
I did. So there were just a lot of firsts throughout her career. She was the first to go to staff college. I think she might have been the first woman to go to staff school as well. In the late 70s, she was supervising what was called the Swinter Trials, service women in non-traditional environments and roles. And she was also involved when the decision was made that it wouldn't be a trial whether women went into combat or not, because women had already proven that they could do the jobs. It would be an implementation. Even as she retired, she was still coming back with the Minister's Advisory Board on gender integration, I think it was called. I think that most women in the military, depending on their occupation, depending on their role, could look at Sheila's history and find something in that history and say, oh, I wouldn't have been doing that if she hadn't done that. I know there were jobs that I had that I would not have had if she hadn't had them before me. You know, she led the way.
She worked her way from an entry-level position where she joined after university to the highest levels that a woman had achieved at that point. It took her 30 years to do it, but she hit those targets and made that role.
She took her inspiration for her military career from meeting Norwegian soldiers and sailors during World War II at Camp Norway. Those sailors and soldiers had come there from Norway when they couldn't go home, when the Nazis had invaded Norway, and they were becoming Royal Norwegian Free Navy. She lived about a block away from Camp Norway. Her father spoke enough Norwegian that he invited a lot of those sailors to their home. And she would have been between 5 and 10 years old, meeting those young men a long way from home, and it inspired her to want to be in the military. So again, it was like that full circle of Lunenburg to a long military career to back to Lunenburg again. After I retired, I moved to Lunenburg. I didn't know when I moved to Lunenburg that Sheila Hellstrom had been born and raised there. Shortly after I moved, my name appeared in the newspaper, and I got a phone call. And I probably hadn't talked to her for 15 years at that point. And it was, "Hi, Cheryl, this is Sheila. I'm calling you from Ottawa. I just read the local newspaper, and I saw your name in the newspaper." And it was just like, wow, you're reading the local newspaper in Lunenburg. Who'd have thought? But she had maintained her subscription in that newspaper throughout her military career and after. She had a subscription to that newspaper for 60, 65 years. She saw my name in it. She called again to offer support. And in that case, I tried to call her ma'am, and she said, "No, it's Sheila." And it was just absolutely lovely. So she had been a role model. She was a mentor, and for me, she was a very important mentor. And she became a friend. There's still things to be done in the military, of course. You will have heard in the news recently some sexual assault situations or harassment accusations, and those have to be looked at as well. And they have to be looked at not just as gender issues, but as human decency issues. And I think that kind of inclusion and diversity is all about what Sheila was about as well, that she didn't just stop at gender integration. She carried on in terms of, let's include everybody, let's respect everyone, let's treat everyone well. And by treating everyone well, we'll have a more operationally effective Canadian Forces.
So what's the plan for the artifacts now?
Well, these are going to be on display in the Royal Canadian Legion in Lunenburg. But the main thing is having the Legion have these on display, and they will have her story included in their display of historical military artifacts.
Well, I'd certainly like to thank Cheryl for sharing the story and bringing these items to us today. It certainly has made a whole difference in our understanding of Canadian women's role in the Army, and particularly the Air Force and the Navy. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think that's the biggest part, is that the legacy continues on, and Cheryl wants to promote that legacy, and I think it should be. It's a celebration of a career person that devoted their life to the Canadian Forces and serving within the forces, and I think that's the biggest marquee that we hold from that.